Okay, so I'm going to have a less dry video this time. I'm going to be talking about Canadian military history. Specifically, the question, were commanders and staffs of the Canadian Corps in the early battles of 1915, 1916 donkeys? I will argue that they were not. Um, and to do this, I will use a case study of the Second Battle of Ypres from the 22nd to the 25th of April 1915. And I will then talk a bit about how gas doctrine developed after that to kind of show the development. So, to do that, I use some outline notes. So let's start off. Who's a good person to start off with? We're going to talk about this. We're going to talk about... Ooh, Andrew, I wrote... I've never met... I've never heard the name said in public. Andrew Arachi. That's what I'm saying. Andrew Arachi. He wrote a book called Shoestring Soldiers about the 1st Canadian Division. Oh, of course, Alan Clark. We're going to start off with Alan Clark. He wrote a book called The Donkeys in the 1960s, where we're going to talk about... anyway, where the term donkey comes from, we'll talk a bit about that. Second, Shoestring Soldiers. Also, he wrote an article, 1 CIB at 2nd Ypres. After that, we will talk about another good source. Ah, yes, Tim Cook. Tim Travers also wrote an article called Historians in Conflict. Good. Tim Cook wrote something called Creating the Faith. And he also wrote a book called No Place to Run, which is a very good book. You should, if you're watching this nonsense, you should pause it immediately or turn it off and just go get a copy of No Place to Run. It's very good. I believe it was his doctoral dissertation. And, oh, yes, Bill Rawling, of course, in Surviving Trench Warfare, which is a great name for a book. Or a metal band. Yeah. Bill Rawling, yeah. Surviving Trench Warfare. Okay, that's pretty good. That's a solid 6 sources to talk about. In terms of structure, we will talk about first a timeline and what happened. Timeline. No, we're going to introduce, timeline and introduction of the donkey concept. Second, we will talk about responses to that, alternative viewpoints. And the third thing we'll talk about, that's basically it, and then I'll conclude. I've got a clever conclusion. By the way, this is what the note sheet looks like. It's very high tech, and I'll be using my high-tech whiteboard. Okay, so let's talk about donkeys and the Second Battle of Ypres. So Alan Clark wrote a book in the 60s called The Donkeys, where he brings forth this kind of, to use the language of, evocative language that the British, soldiers in the First World War were lines led by donkeys. You had these kind of noble, quick-thinking troops, Tommies, Canadians, whatever, Frenchmen, poilus, and they're led by these chateau generals who just kind of send them to their deaths and don't have a schmick and that kind of stuff. And he portrays the Battle of Ypres, where on the 22nd of April, the Germans attack, actually to set up the line, what it sort of looks like is you'll have F3 CIB under Turner. 2 CAB under a guy named Arthur Currie, who eventually became a big name. 1 CAB in reserve under Mercer. And then you have the French territorials, and then you have the Germans. Right, so this is roughly what it looks like, okay? It's around the town of Ypres, just the south. On the 22nd of April, this happens. The Germans advance behind a gas attack. A first wave of chlorine gas. They disrupt the French territorials. The Canadians are able to kind of move to their left to the west. Actually, it looks like that. There you go, to the west. And fill the gap. Then a counterattack is sort of organized. The 1st Canadian CIB, or 1st Canadian Brigade, attacks to kind of plug the gap on the night of the 23rd to the 24th. And then on the 24th, the Germans attack again with another gas attack, this time directed against the Canadians. And the Canadians manage to hold, but they withdraw. And at one point, Arthur Currie leaves his brigade to go look for reinforcements. When he goes to get the reinforcements, he encounters General Snow with the British division sent to reinforce them. So basically, Snow had been given authority over all of the reinforcements. He gets chewed out by Snow, goes back to the front. At one point, Currie actually encounters guys on a ridge who'd withdrawn and just has to kind of, without orders, basically, and has to kind of coax them back into the front line. I won't get into the detailed historical controversies because I'm already 7 minutes in, and I have an hour to rate this paper. So, in Alan Clark's view, this shows that he brings up the fact that the British actually had, and French had, rough warnings about a gas attack incoming, and the fact that it was so chaotic and you have people running everywhere shows that, by people running everywhere, I mean there's no plan for when the French territorials collapse. The counterattack is hasty. When they get whacked again, when everyone gets whacked again on the 24th, it just kind of shows that there isn't really a plan. Snow's headquarters is chaos. Bill Rawling, who wrote a book called Surviving Trench Warfare, says something broadly similar. In Rawling's point of view, the Canadians just weren't ready for the kind of battle that they were fighting. Now, some of the criticisms of this point of view, and I agree with the critics on this one, actually, is, take, for example, Andrei Arachie's work, right? So both in Shoestring Soldiers and his article on 1 CIB's counterattack, the battle itself was so chaotic, the fact that it wasn't a disaster is indicative of some pretty quick thinking and fairly effective leadership on the part of command and staffs of 1st Canadian Division. So, for example, right, imagine you're a Canadian soldier. I mean, by this point in the war, odds are you're British-born, you've spent a lot of your time in a city. You're probably a bit older, actually. This whole idea that it's all young Canadian farm boys is just, it's nonsense. It's garbage. Anyway, you're sitting there manning the line, and you're with the 3rd Canadian Infantry Brigade on the left, at the west. There you go, on the left, yeah. Suddenly, there's this weird green stuff, and the French are collapsing, and you don't quite know what's going on. And it's chaos, and even for you on the ground, you barely know what's going on. Imagine the staff to the rear, right? So everyone thinks, oh, well, if commanders and staff were just more forward, they'd understand everything. But I'm not sure that's true. If If it's a gas attack, a weapon that no one's ever really, or no Canadian certainly has ever seen, or British person has ever seen, it's just, whether you're a general or a private, you know, what's going on, you don't really know. Also at this time, right, it's time before like radios, right? Like you wouldn't be able, if a commander is that far forward, it means by necessity he can't command a unit to his right, right? It's just, it's not feasible with the technology, right? So they're going to logically be to the rear. And in fact, the British at some point have to stop ordering Camberley grads, like their high-end staff officers, to go forward because they keep getting killed, and we just can't train any more of these guys. Like, get a trained staff officer takes like a full year. They just don't have the resources. Anyway, so given that kind of chaos, Araki points out, Andrew. I'm gonna call him Andrew, and if I meet him at a conference, I will learn his name and call him sir and doctor, because what he is. So that counterattack that happens on the night of the 23rd, 24th, can you imagine? You know, the French to the west have been shattered. There's bits of their formation everywhere. No one knows what's going on. There's this weird chemical attack stuff they've been using. You have to take Mauser Ridge, which is the objective to the north of Ypres that they have to take to stabilize. You think some kind of counterattack is going to come from the French, some supporting attack. It never materializes. Even just making it to the starting line and doing what they end up doing is they went far forward. They end up on Mauser Ridge, but they end up retiring to the south of Mauser Ridge. If you don't have good march discipline, if you don't know what you're doing, and these guys had done some training in England up to this point on Salisbury Plain before they deployed, it's not going to happen. And I'll say this as someone who's done some soldiering in his life. Road moves are actually very difficult. From a staff and planning point of view, they're really hard to get right. And doing that under conditions of some kind of novel, devastating weapon that you don't really have much of a defense for is a testament to the kind of the generally pretty good quality of the commanders at the time. If we look at another controversy, it has to do with the performance of the 3rd Brigade and the 2nd Brigade on the attack of 24 April. So the 24th of April, the Germans... So the 22nd, you know, the Canadians got a bit affected by gas, but it's mostly the French that took the brunt of it. The 24th is when they really get whacked. And Tim Cook actually brings this up in No Place to Run. That's the real test. So, yeah, the Germans put in a pretty firm attack the 24th. At points during the battle, both the 2nd and the 3rd Brigade, excuse me, I should say the 3rd and the 2nd for going west to east. On your screen, how's that work? Anyway, west to east, 2nd and the 3rd, they withdraw a bit without orders. Now, you can't really have it both ways, can you, right? You can't say these staffs were just donkeys, and then also blame them for retreating or withdrawing to more defensible positions to reorganize in the event of a gas attack. I mean, if they're donkeys, they would have just stood and died for no reason. There are a couple of events where people are open to criticism. I mentioned earlier Arthur Currie. At one point, he actually leaves his headquarters to go look for reinforcements personally. He gets chewed out by the British general, a guy named Snow, who'd been sent to all the reinforcements were set up through this other divisional headquarters. It's really weird. He gets chewed out by Snow. At one point, he finds kind of a line of Canadian troops that had kind of just started wandering towards the rear. He gathers them and brings them forward. Tim Travers talks about how, in the historiography after the war, the British official historian and the Canadian official historian, a guy named Duguid, kind of get into a tiff about where the evaluation of Currie's performance. It's an interesting read anyway. It's an interesting discussion, right? It's an interesting discussion about what we can really expect at this point. I think given given the complexity of the battle. But they did about everything they could expect. And yeah, it didn't work out well for Currie. On the other hand, he didn't have much of a staff by then, right? So Bill Rawling talks about that during the war, soldiers and officers developed a relationship where the soldiers were technicians and the officers became managers. But that takes time, right? And for a pretty green division, its first big battle, it's a pretty impressive performance. So after the Second Battle of Ypres, it's during 1915 that the Canadian Corps was formed. I'm going to talk about the development of gas doctrine. So Tim Cook, again, in both Creating the Faith and No Place to Run, discusses how, because the Canadians tended to work with each other, right, you have the Canadian Corps, which is first formed in September 1915, immediately starts addressing its efforts at doctrinal development towards defensive gas warfare. They'd seen a British use of gas at Loos, and it had not gone very well, so they start developing it pretty heartily. And by 1915, they're already starting to implement Corps-wide gas doctrine, which is pretty impressive. And in fact, there's a great anecdote about Naismith, a guy named Lieutenant Colonel Naismith. So he had wanted to join the forces, join the Canadian Expeditionary Force. He wasn't in good health, so he refused. He appeals to Sam Hughes, and in the intervening, Sam Hughes says, "Fine, you can go in a scientific capacity," and he says, "Okay, I'm gonna set up labs to test for water, right? Making sure the water is safe for troops to drink." The same guy. The attack goes in on the 22nd of April. He takes samples from that attack. He looks at the coloration of brass buttons and says, "Oh man, this is probably chlorine." And they'd already issued some really preliminary instructions to troops on the 24th, which is remarkable if you're looking at the development of gas doctrine and if you're looking at the effectiveness of formation. Donkeys don't do that, right? So yeah, the Canadian Corps begins developing its own gas doctrine, and it actually becomes a fairly it becomes a very successful endeavor. And that's one of Cook's argument, is that it was successful not just because they figured the technical stuff out. If you're going to create the faith, you have to. Gas discipline requires the troops believe in their equipment and believe in the procedures, and that happened with remarkable efficiency. In less than a year, actually less than 6 months, they'd already got to work on that. So that kind of calls into question the whole lions and donkeys sort of deal. So to conclude, in my view, the Second Battle of Ypres is an example of not just lions and donkeys is actually, it's a false dichotomy. Right? In reality, staffs and their commanders in the First World War, in fact, their troops too, everyone was more like a rat running through a maze. They're just trying to figure it out. And it's the first time they've seen a maze like this, right? Gotta say, they were successful. I mean, empirically, they were successful. So this will sound much better in writing, but yeah, rats in a maze is a far better analogy than lions or donkeys.